All right, we are going to talk something adjacent to the Sandman show or related to the Sandman Netflix show. There will not be spoilers for the Sandman Netflix show. I'm giving people time to watch that show before I talk about it on this channel. But something blew up on Twitter, and I'm just like, man, I felt so bad for this happened to be a woman who made this comment and just got frickin' dogpiled for it. And I'm sure she can handle it. And I think that this is someone, based on some indications on her Twitter bio, is not afraid of hot takes. But still, identity of the speaker shouldn't matter as much as, was this backlash fair? And so I'm going to talk about the whole Johanna Constatine, because that's how it's pronounced on Sandman, versus John Constantine thing on the basis of this particular tweet. I'm not going to show the person's account because, Christ, they've limited who can respond to their account, because it was not limited when I responded to her at the beginning. She has since limited her account. So that always sucks when that happens. It's good the feature is there, but so what she said was revealing that Johanna Constatine is bisexual and then immediately describing her as a selfish, ruthless coward. I'll read that again because I botched it. Revealing that Johanna Constatine is bisexual and then immediately describing her as a selfish, ruthless coward. Slow clap for truly impressive, particularly classic biphobia. Now, I'm sure you can all probably predict what the problem people had with that was. I don't have the same problem with what she said. Yeah, it's woke language, right? It's a phobia. And the problem is, people, whenever anybody brings up the topic of biphobia, if you're pansexual, it's way worse. But even within the LGBTQ plus community, there's a lot of like either erasure or stereotyping of people who are not on a clear team. And the problem with, I'm going to call him John Constantine, because that's how they pronounce it on Legends of Tomorrow, is that if you just describe him on paper the way Johanna Constatine is sort of revealed in this way, a big character dump that way, I can see, don't jump on me here, hear me out. I can see why somebody would see that as biphobic, because it's stomping on that stereotype of bisexual people not being able to, commit, being untrustworthy, being liars. Oh no, you're really gay, just can't come out, whatever. Now, we're talking about a character established decades ago when it was a very different time. And, the way they sort of slowly rolled out what goes on with John in Hellblazer, he's very complex. And to try, I disagree with the way people depict him as, a selfish, ruthless coward. Yes, that is how he sort of self-describes. But remember yesterday's video was talking Butcher from The Boys pushes people away with words? John Constantine does the same thing. He's complex. And I think the fact that people summarize the character that way to jump on someone for having an opinion, I don't think that's giving the character due credit. But there's another layer to this that I want to And again, this is touching on the Sandman show, but there will not be spoilers. The Sandman started as a Vertigo comic, a DC sub-imprint. I think it was the first Vertigo comic, but I could be wrong. There were DC comic characters tied all through it. A lot of the characters in Sandman originally came from, Weird Tales or an Elvira comic or something like that. And so they were sort of reusing characters that were created in other places, reimagining some of them. Some of them were new. But, DC does this a lot, and often it's quite good. Doom Patrol and stuff like that. Marvel did it with Guardians of the Galaxy. Not an unheard of thing. But what's different about the Netflix Sandman series is that it has been surgically removed from the DC universe. It's set in its own world. And so, the Martian Manhunter, Swamp Thing, Element Girl, I think, Dr. Destiny, all those characters no longer are there. Including Lucifer, because of the TV show that's now on Netflix, but started on network, and then John Constantine. He interacted with the the Sandman book quite a bit, and so Lucifer this is not a spoiler, it's been announced already. Lucifer is played by Gwendolyn Christie in the Netflix Sandman show, who was Brienne of Tarth on Game of Thrones. And I like her take in interviews. I'll spare that because it's not relevant to this conversation. But in the comics, there is a character named Johanna Constatine, who is an ancestor of John Constantine's. Sign, whatever you want. I don't know how somebody can claim there's a default pronunciation in a comic because there are not sounds in a comic. It's written. But whatever, apparently that's canon, that it's Tyne like wine. But she is an ancestor. I think she was 300 years in the past. She owns the mansion initially that becomes central to the action in the Sandman. But she is not John. She is her own person. She has her own story. And because the Sandman is separated from DC continuity in the show, someone coming into this show cold with no knowledge of DC Comics can't be expected to know any of that. Not only is that just, the Sandman originally came out in 1989. It was hot shit when I was 16 years old and a goth. And it's been a real challenge for me because going back and revisiting an adaptation of something you thought was awesome when you were 16, it's tough. But, a viewer of the Netflix show cannot be expected to know any of this. And so we get into the question. In that case, the tweet was totally fair game, and it wasn't fair to jump on her for her opinion. It's a completely valid opinion in the way it's presented in the show, where there is no requirement to know anything about Hellblazer or John Constantine or Tyne or Legends of Tomorrow, or it's not in the DCU. And this is where things get really interesting. Because if it's not in the DCU, is Johanna Constatine a gender swap? Now, there are numerous race and gender swaps in the Sandman. Um, some of them, like I said, required because they cannot use the DC Comics characters. Those are under license to other properties through Warner Brothers. Though I don't know why. I guess they just wanted to completely go in a different direction and keep, because they wouldn't want to put the Sandman in like the Lucifer universe, because the Lucifer had a cameo in one of the Arrowverse crossovers. I guess that's why. Because it would have been kind of, though Tom Bison's Lucifer wouldn't really switch in the show. Anyway, can you call someone a gender swap of a character that never existed in this world? Interesting thought problem, right? Now, it is true that instead of using Johanna Constantine's story, they do use a lot of John Constantine's stuff, notably the connection to Astra, which I don't know why they keep going back to that. Well, it worked in the book really well, but it's one of those things that you can't slow burn it enough to, anyway. And this is when we go, how much do we trust what Jenna Coleman, who plays Garrett, I love Oswin from Doctor Who, okay? But, you know, how much do we trust the canon of an actor's comments on what informed their performance? Just because you use a technique doesn't mean it's inherent to the work, right? You know, just because Johnny Depp, for instance, used Keith Richards to base Captain Jack Sparrow on does not mean that Captain Jack Sparrow is in any way Keith Richards, right? Just as an example. You know, same with this take on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I think it was Michael Jackson they claimed to. Anyway, it's an interesting issue that I'm not sure has ever, like, this is sort of uncharted territory, because other characters are clearly alterations of the characters in the Sandman comic, and but in the Dreaming, the one that they redid in 2018, it is Johanna. Johanna's in these stories. Like, is it a gender swap because they use details of his story? And I don't know. And this goes back to, can we defend against the biphobic trope of a dishonest, dishonest, manipulative, cowardly, bisexual person, which is, as the tweeter said, pretty classic biphobia. Whether you like the character or not, she's got a point. And then you get into the question of, well, is that okay? Give me a minute. For me, it was disappointing that they went with some of John Constantine's story points, because they're not essential to the Sandman lore. They're not. I would have preferred she be just her own character, precisely because she's her own character. They can't use John Constantine. So that's my opinion. It would require spoilers for me to back up that opinion. So let me jump to something I can talk about without spoilers. This is really hard. Okay. Argument made that it's biphobic. Is that defensible in the story? I mean, theoretically, like, where is it a character with flaws versus a lazy, bigoted trope? Now we're getting in tropes versus women territory. Whoa. this is a very subjective thing, and individual mileage may vary. Understanding why someone had a bad reaction to it is not saying there's anything wrong with having a character with those particular flaws. People like that exist in the real world. Amber Heard. I think it's less the character as created and how the character was presented. One of my critiques, and this is not a plot spoiler, of the Sandman is they were a little too, we're going to go right from comic to screen. They didn't adapt it. They didn't adapt it enough in some places. They messed with it too much in others. And one of the things that is a challenge when you're going from comic book to live action is the voiceover, the description box, as opposed to one of the things the Sandman did was had these very artistic word balloon boxes for the different endless. And obviously that you lose a lot of the aesthetic, a lot of the art that made Sandman cool. I would have personally preferred they did it like Arcane style to preserve some of that, but they went live action. We judge what's there, not what I would like it to be. But presenting a character like that shows you can call it an unforced error, right? Because they could have shown that she was selfish, ruthless, and cowardly, right? Not say she's selfish, ruthless, coward, right? Let her show that in the performance. Why do we need to say it right off the bat, right? I mean, you could compare and contrast the Sandman adaptation and the adaptation of The Boys on Amazon Prime, because they don't need to. They do the other way. Oh, Homelander's basically, he's our hero, all that stuff. Homelander's a messed up piece of shit, right? But they're all messed up pieces of shit. But they don't sit there doing voiceovers about what messed up pieces of shittiness they are. They do it in the performances and the stories, and they show, don't tell. It's totally fine to say they blew the introduction to the character and still like the character and still discuss the creative pros and cons of the choice they made to graft on some of John's story onto Johanna. But that brings me back to the central question I'm having is, can you call it a gender swap for or against if it's a character that doesn't exist in that universe? Because again, then you get into, if that's your definition, if you say yes there, yes, it's still a gender swap, even though John Constantine never exists in the Sandman universe. Well, what about something like Watchmen or something like The Boys, where these characters are supreme or invincible, where these characters are evocative of superhero tropes? I mean, I believe the Deep in The Boys is actually a race swap from the comics. But, that's a one-to-one that's from the comics to same character. Not, it's not like, Translucent wasn't in the comic. You can't go, anything was different about him. But if we start going, okay, this is a character, because Johanna Constatine in the comics was an homage to John Constantine. That's established. But homage is not a swap, right? It's not Hulk to She-Hulk. It's not, Iron Man to Ironheart, so on and so forth. This is a character evocative in a universe that has now been separated from a larger, like, persistent universe. It's an interesting adaptive challenge, and it is important when you're doing cultural analysis to establish the baseline here and be consistent, because you can't use one way of measuring, say, Sandman, because you want to dump on, oh, it's all these race swaps and gender swaps and all these things. It's not as easy with this, because Lucian, for instance, the librarian servant, is a white guy in the Sandman comic. It's the same character. Now a black woman, sort of leaning non-binary. The Dream having a black servant, kind of awkward for me. But again, that's not a spoiler that casting was announced. That's an easier one to compare, right? Because we didn't have a Lucienne in the original comic as well as a Lucien. Johanna Constatine existed as a character. And this is what I'm struggling with, because this may seem like a nitpick, but in terms of the type of analysis I do, original character that's an homage, for instance, Homelander is an homage to Superman, or like Bizarro Superman. Soldier Boy is a, Bizarro Captain America. Starlight's costume in The Boys is very evocative of Mary Marvel's. Queen Maeve is like a pastiche of Wonder Woman and Xena. We don't go, Starlight was inspired by Mary Marvel, who was inspired by Shazam, therefore it's a gender swap. You get what I'm saying? And why does this matter? Well, because the complaints of gender swapping, the complaints of race swapping are that there is nothing creatively sacrosanct about these characters in their original form. They are fungible or fungible. Magus, 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 potato, potato. You can just swap them out, interchangeable. And fungibility is a marker of objectification. And that's why people get upset. They feel like it's cheapening the character to just swap out one quality and put in another. People didn't like some of the race swapping in The Witcher because it's an inherently Polish story. Like, you don't get more Polish than The Witcher. And so the argument is that they didn't actually understand the story they were adapting. And also sort of the tensions of being a visible outsider in that world. I still haven't really felt like, in my gut, I don't care, but intellectually I understand the criticism, right? Then you get into inherentness, right? The difference between Peter Parker Spider-Man, Miles Morales Spider-Man, different characters, right? And the cheap shit they tried to do with the Mighty Thor, where she's not Lady Thor, she's Thor. She's Jane fucking Foster, man. And that was just some of the... Marvel and DC were doing some of those weird bait and switches. They do them, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They're always a risk, right? When you go out and misdirect an audience, proceed with caution. But getting back to the Sandman, it's not just the change to one character when they change certain things in terms of the appearance of the character. It's changing the lore, names, There are very strict naming conventions in the Dreaming. The Endless are all supposed to be like white skinned, like not pale like me, like white, inhuman. And then Neil Gaiman went on Twitter and fought with people over Death before the thing came out, Death the character, right? And that one I'm sitting there going, all right, yeah, white goth chick with an Eye of Horus and an Ankh doesn't age well. And I say this as somebody who helped my friend with a photography project where she drew an Eye of Horus on Hurrah, however it's pronounced, on my pale ass face because we were 16 and Sandman was cool, right? Ankh, symbol for death, goth, right? I get why a broader audience that does not, it's like society evolves, right? Gwendolyn Christie's take on Lucifer I thought was very interesting. And again, it's just her process. It's not the character herself. But she said, Lucifer is not human. Therefore, gender doesn't exist. I just ignored it. And I'm like, that's so cool. I love that. Right? Because, yeah, these aren't exactly characters that were born in a traditional way. Right? And then you're like, well, why are you bothered that Lucienne is now black? Well, Lucienne is not an Endless. Lucienne is not a being of power. Lucienne is a servant. It's different. They can't manifest, right? In the way they want. Unlike somebody like Lucifer, who can probably take any form they want. They're a freaking, angel. And so this stuff, you could argue Lucifer is not a gender swap in Sandman. Because one, it's not the Lucifer from DC Comics. Two, they're taking it, there's no gender here. But then, of course, they made a big deal about Desire being non-binary. And the difference between non-binary and drag, gender nonconformance and drag, transgenderism and drag, right? It's like when you get mishy, mashy, mushy, timey, wimey, wibbly, wobbly about your lore and about your metaphysics here, because the Sandman's still very mired in Christian metaphysics, so these things matter very much, right? But, when you're messy about your world building here, it makes it very difficult to let the audience follow what you're doing. Which is why, again, I keep comparing it to The Boys, which I have gone back and I skipped the first episode because of what happens in the comics, and I went back and rewatched it. I'm like, oh my god, I'm just gonna watch this all over again because this is really good, and so I'll watch a couple Sandmans and then watch a Boys, and I'm getting through it. But that show knows exactly what it's doing with its lore and what they're doing with the characters and what it says about masculinity and femininity and good and evil and all that stuff. It has to be very intentional because it's biting, cutting, brutal, visceral, literally satire. It exists on a razor's edge and it's designed to make you uncomfortable. But the Sandman's been labeled groundbreaking television. And it went through a ton of development hell, and I think people are being very kind to it because, they like I said in the video yesterday, it's hard to get anything made, and 35 years to get something made, oy. So I think they're trying to give Neil Gaiman a ton of benefit of the doubt. But these sorts of things are houses of cards in terms of analysis, and we do have to be very, very intentional with these sort of colloquial terms like gender swap, like race swap, right? We have to be careful how we define them. We have to be careful how to apply them, which is why I go back to the central problem of, is Johanna Constatine a gender swap if John Constantine has never existed in that universe? I argue no, because she is a pre-existing homage character. It is a hybrid. They use some of his story in her, but that's combining characters, right? That's an amalgam character. That's not the same. They did that on Game of Thrones too. They have a bunch of stuff that happened to Sansa on the TV show that happens to other characters in the books. That's not the same thing. A hybridization of a character is not a swap. And if we're not going to be assholes about this, these terms have to matter. So I'm interested in what you guys think about this. Looking forward to your comments on this. I'm deliberately leaving this open-ended so we can have a discussion instead of a Twitter pile on, because holy shit, people need to be able to voice opinions. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. Thanks for watching.